To help you go home earlier, we're breaking down 3 systems that you can use to save hours on admin every month and actually leave work at work. So your time is your money. Let's get into it. The third and final system in the series that practitioners can put into place to help them go home earlier is weekly planning and priority setting. What do we mean by this, and how will it help?
So we all have bigger goals than simply, what's happening for us today. Maybe it's creating a community, maybe it's growing your practice, maybe it's expanding your services, maybe it's moving to a bigger clinic or a space. But it's very easy to be in the busyness of every day, and a ton of time can go by before you actually start to take steps to move toward those longer term goals that you might have.
Why is weekly planning so important, especially for solo practitioners?
Yeah, so most practitioners are working really hard, especially solo practitioners are working really hard on the day to day, and your day can sometimes feel sort of reactive, right? So it's really easy to kind of make time for this later, quote unquote, later when you're a solo practitioner, right? You want to get through the day, you're reacting to everything that's going on, and it's very easy to say, I mean, I've been guilty of this myself in the past when I've worked solo, is okay, I'll worry about this later. I'll worry about this later. So it's an easy kind of slippery slope to go down. But you want to make sure that you're asking, what can I focus on today? And then you end up doing whatever, sort of feels the most urgent. But that's usually not what is moving you towards your longer term goals. It's usually what's keeping you afloat for the day. So without a weekly plan, everything sort of feels equally important. And if everything's equally important, like nothing is actually important, right? It's kind of everything is sort of jumbled and you don't really give real attention to particular things.
So where do we start? What does a good weekly planning look like?
Yeah. So the goal is you want to create a container for your week. So you're directing your time and you're much more intentional than you would be otherwise. So here's how I would suggest doing it. First, I'm going to ask you to do another brain dump. So get everything out of your head. Client care, admin, business development, personal stuff that might bleed into your workday, anything that's kind of affecting your workday and happening in your work life. Just get it down. You have a list that's been created, and I want you to choose your top 3 priorities. So not more than 3. More than 3 is going to be really difficult to actually, just kind of wrap your brain around and manage. So what would make this week feel successful? What 3 things would make this week feel successful? So for example, it could be, kind of finish refining my new client intake process, or follow up with at least 10 clients who have, lapsed and haven't been in for a while. It could be something about, kind of examining your financials for the quarter. I do want you to remember this should be dedicated to weekly planning. And I do encourage you to do the same thing on a quarterly level and on an annual level, right? So for the annual level, you kind of have like your North Star goal that you're working toward. And then as you break it down into the smaller chunks of time, you have priorities and goals that are appropriate for that smaller chunk of time. So this is the weekly stuff, right? What do I need to accomplish this week? And how can you create small micro actions and steps for the week that are going to carry you slowly through that and that are actually doable, right? We don't want to create something here that's not actually doable. So something that can be done within a week, and it's things that are going to lead you towards your longer term goals, and that can get done while all this daily stuff is happening as well. The next thing that I want you to do is block off some of your time, right? So take a look at the gaps that you have from when you come into the office, between appointments, to when you leave the office. Take a look at the time and just start to sort of, block off some time that you want to dedicate to these top 3 priorities. And you want to treat them like appointments to yourself. That's not to say that they can't shift. This is another thing I sort of changed just basically like in my own personal process after I had my second child. Everything got much more fluid. So I kind of changed the way I do things in that in the morning, I do decide where those blocks are going to go, but the blocks are still established. So if you can block your whole week in this planning session, perfect. If you have to move a block, life happens. Don't beat yourself up for that. But do block the time and do make sure that happens, right? So set an appointment with yourself. Make sure it's on your calendar and dedicated. The next thing that I want you to do is decide what's not in motion, like what's not happening this week. So as important as it is to say, these are my top 3 priorities, it's equally as important to say, these are the things that are just not going to happen this week because it's not all possible to do in the week, right? Something has to give. So if you've decided intentionally that these 3 things are your priorities, and priority number 5 is listed here, you'll feel much better about postponing that and putting that on another week because you know that your top 3 are intentionally higher priority. The next thing I want you to do to try to alleviate the life happens moments is build in a bit of a buffer. So don't schedule at 100% capacity. If you're in from 9 to 5, don't block the entire everything and not leave yourself time for, lunch or running to the bathroom. Schedule about 20 to 30% of buffer for the unexpected. And you want this to kind of, in the end, become a 30 to 40-minute weekly session that you have with yourself.
Amazing. I really like the inclusion of buffer time and realizing life happens. I think it's so easy when you're trying to be the most productive version of yourself. You just think you're going to be, perfectly scheduled. And if you don't do it that way, you didn't accomplish it. So, but that's not reality. Life always gets in the way and they'll always need little buffer time. So yeah.
It does. I actually just did a training that about time blocking, and just like time blocking seems to be very like kind of polarizing. Some people are very big fans. Anytime I post content in my group about it, yes, 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 or no, 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 like I can't do it. I can't stick to it. It makes me feel bad. Or, people like live and die for it. I used to be on that live and die for it side. And then once I had my second child, I was just falling out of the blocks all the time. I was not sticking to my blocks. So I started kind of doing it. I had read about this other kind of approach where you still have time blocks, but in the morning you sort of, puzzle piece them together in a different way. And just like kind of finding your way is finding the way to make it work for you is, when you sort of really do start to reap those benefits, because it happens to all of us, like whether, kids, no kids, like there's no one's life exists without 20 to 30% of like variation in some way, shape or form.
How does this actually save time after we've done all these systems?
Love that question, because I think a lot of times it might sound like I'm proposing to add something else to your already very long to-do list and busy schedule. It actually is going to save you a lot of decision-making energy. So you're going to take the time to do this and you're going to be focused. You're not going to, sort of wonder each day, what am I going to focus on? You already know. You can immediately start to execute, right? So how great would that be? Think about that. You come into work and you're immediately starting to execute. That eliminates hours of mental spinning. You get more done in less time. It also will improve your focus, right? So you won't be thinking about that other thing that you have to do, because you already know when you will actually do that other thing, or you'll know and feel good about your decision that's just not top priority for this week. But it helps you sort of win that mental debate, right? Sometimes like our brains start to debate with us like, oh, we do have to check email. This would be a great time to kind of stop doing this and start doing that. And if you have time set aside for that, you sort of help yourself win that battle against your brain. And you can really feel more in control of your time instead of constantly like sort of in this reactionary, kind of defense mode. I don't like the word defense, but in this reactionary mode. So you start to make the most of the time that you do have.
There is an element of knowing what your priorities are and how to make this list. So what if someone can't figure out what their priorities should be?
Yeah, if you feel like, you kind of need some more clarity, it can take a bit of trial and error. It can take a bit of practice. It can take a bit of, kind of making a list and then looking back after the week is over, or at your next, kind of weekly planning session and say, oh, that didn't really work. But we added this 5-step system for you to use in the coming weeks as a template for figuring out your priorities. And you can take notes of, what was helpful and where you feel like you can improve. And that's going to be shared in the comments as well. And if you need help figuring this out, I offer a breakthrough strategy session to my clients where we spend 90 minutes, talking through, you answer some questions previously, and we kind of go through them and just get really clear on what's working, what's not, and what's really important. What are we working for? What are our priorities? And what structure needs to exist to make those possible? And then after the call, I developed for you a 90-day action plan. It runs kind of like a timeline, so it's very specific what you're going to be doing each week, each day. If you have a team, like who's going to be delegated what, and that sort of thing. It's basically a roadmap to getting the goals that we've decided achieved over the next 90 days. And then once tying it back to the weekly planning, once you have this clarity, I feel like, and I can say from experience, that all the planning becomes much easier, right? When you have that North Star that you're working towards, your quarterly planning becomes much easier. When your quarterly plan is good, your weekly planning becomes much easier. So that can be really helpful in that way.
Thanks so much, Jen. We appreciate you and your organizational expertise.
Yeah, you're welcome. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to do it.